Today we're going to talk about base 10 with negative exponents. But before we begin with negative exponents, let's review base 10 with positive exponents. If we had 10 to the third, then expanded form, that was 10 times 10 times 10. And then in standard form, that was the same as 1,000. And if you recall, the 3 matches the zeros here. It also matches the 3's in the number in standard form. If we have 10 squared, that means we have 10 times 10, and that is 100. If we have 10 to the first, we have 110, and that is just 10 in both expanded form and standard form. 10 to the 0 power, as you recall, it equals 1. Now, if we look at what's happening to the numbers here, essentially we are dividing by 10 to get to the previous number. And if we divide 1 by 10, what we would really end up with would be 0.1. And that means that 10 to the negative 1 equals 0.1 or 1/10. So if you'll recall, here's our invisible decimal point. Invisible decimal point. We don't write it, but it's really there. And every time we divide by 10, all we're really doing is moving that decimal point one more place to the left, because we're dividing by 10 to get from this number to the next one. So if we follow the pattern and we have 10 to the negative 2, to move this decimal point one more place to the left, this would be 0.01. In other words, this would be the same as 1/100th. If we have 10 to the negative third, we'd be moving the decimal point one place to the left. This would be 0.001. 10 to the negative fourth, we would again be moving the decimal point one more place. So we just continued the pattern here. We're dividing by 10. But because it has such a nice pattern, we don't really have to do the math. We can just follow the pattern through memorization. All right, let's talk a little more about negative exponents, because we can simplify them and write them in a number of different forms. So we have a sheet here, and we could write, we have exponent with base 10, a fraction in exponent form, fraction in expanded form, fraction standard, decimal standard, and decimal in expanded form. That is a lot to think about, but once we start doing it, you're going to see how easy this really is. If we have 10 to the negative fourth, we already know what it looks like as a decimal, but when we write it as a fraction in exponent form, what this really means is we're writing the reciprocal of 10, which would be 1/10, and our exponent now becomes positive. So that would be 1 over 10 to the 4th. If we're going to write it in expanded form, that would be 1 over 10 times 10 times 10. When we simplify, multiply all these 10's out, make it standard, this would be 1 over 10,000. And in decimal form, remember, that would be 3 zeros and a 1. Now notice, when we write this in standard form, the zeros after the decimal point are always going to be 1 less than the exponent. So if we have a 4, we're only going to have 3 zeros and then the 1. And in expanded form, this would just be 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1. All right? If we have 10 to the negative third, that would be the same as 1 over 10 to the third. And our exponent becomes positive once we put it in the denominator. In expanded form, we would have 10 times 10 times 10. Writing it in standard form, that would be 1 over 1,000. As a decimal, that would be 0.001. And in expanded form, that would be 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1. 10 to the negative 2 would be the same as 1 over 10 squared. 1 over 10 times 10 for expanded. When we simplify that denominator, that would be 1 over 100 as our decimal, 0.01. And as a decimal in expanded form, 0.1 times 0.1. And 10 to the negative 1 would be 1 over 10 to the first. As a fraction, we only have 1/10 in the denominator. So expanded form and standard are the same here when our exponent is negative 1 here. And 1/10 is just 0.1. And expanded in decimal form is just 0.1. So just kind of a review here. If our exponent is negative, we write it in fraction form. We write the reciprocal of 10 and the exponent becomes positive. In expanded form, this just means we have 4 tens. When we simplify that, that's 10,000. And a little trick to remember here for your standard decimal form here, after the decimal point, there's always going to be one less zero than your exponent. Thanks for checking in. Hope this was helpful.